to kick off this presentation this afternoon. Good afternoon to everyone. It's delightful to see so many people joining us today. My name's Alistair Leake. I'm the Director of Policy at the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust. I look after the lowland research demonstration farm called the Allerton Project in Leicestershire, where for a relatively short space of 30 years we've been looking at all aspects of arable crop production, biodiversity, and of course soils, which of course is a fraction of time that soils, or indeed the research institute from where he hails, Rothamsted, that has been active in this field for 179 years or so. So welcome, David. I'm delighted to welcome you to this webinar this afternoon, and thank you for to do it. I know you've done it before because of course I saw it at the International Fertilizer Association conference in Cambridge last December, and I really felt that it's all very well those of us that are working in the field talking to each other about the stuff that we're interested to know about, but it's also very important that we talk to people from outside, and you'll know there's huge interest in the moment in all aspects of carbon. We have a woodland carbon code, a peatland carbon code. We ourselves are working on a hectare carbon.
Lost you, Alistair.
David, can I suggest you make a start, but also to everybody on the call, could everyone please mute their microphones apart from David? Thank you very much. David, over to you.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. As Alistair, I think, was saying, I gave a talk about soil carbon at the International Fertilizer Society conference held in Cambridge last December, and he asked me to do pretty much the same thing today for you. So that's what I'm doing, really. So as you see, the title is How Much Carbon Can Realistically Be Sequestered in Arable Soils, and Can We Measure It? So I'm going to start just with a couple of sort of preliminary comments about organic matter and carbon in soil, and then now I saw a note that someone said couldn't see my slides and I seem to be muted. Is that true for everybody?
I can see both and hear you.
Okay, I'll carry on there. Right, so organic matter in soil contains approximately 50% carbon, hence the interest in carbon and soil organic matter. And I always say that we can view soil organic matter through two different lenses. One is what I call the soil health lens, which tells us about how the soil is functioning, and obviously got implications for crops growing and so on. And the other is the global carbon cycle lens. And this is because the amount of organic matter in organic carbon in the world's soils is very large. It's about twice the quantity of carbon in the carbon dioxide, the CO2 in the atmosphere. So it's a big stock. So what happens to it matters. And so we can actually make climate change either a bit better or worse, according to whether we can lock up extra carbon in the world's soil organic matter, or if we release more, like through deforestation, for example. And just the little green box at the bottom is to remind us that it's not all, climate change is not all about carbon, because other trace gases contribute to climate change, and agriculture is involved in them. And nitrous oxide and methane are the ones there. Right, so for soil health or soil quality, I would say it's the flow of carbon through the soil that counts, because organic matter, carbon going through the soil, coming in and being processed by microbes, gives energy to the microbes in the soil. And the microbes do many of the things that we want. They release nitrogen and phosphorus and sulfur for crops, and they make gluey sort of substances that help to hold aggregates together. So it's the flow through the soil that matters, and nearly always more is better, with a few exceptions. And it's also true that even quite a small change in the amount of organic carbon in a soil can actually have a big effect on the functioning of the soil. It can either be good or bad for the physical properties of the soil, according to whether it's gone up or down, even a little bit. Now you see my final point written there is that having increased organic carbon in soil does not guarantee increased crop yields, and that's, you will know that better than I do. But it does tend to give greater year-to-year stability, if you like, against adverse weather, and better aggregate structure, more rainfall infiltration, better water retention. Importantly, decreased fertilizer requirement, because the organic matter is a source of particularly of nitrogen, and actually just contributing to greater sustainability of cropping in the long term. Now, from the climate change point of view, for trying to slow climate change or mitigate climate change, we have to have an additional transfer of carbon from the CO2 in the atmosphere to the land through plants into the soil. Not just a redistribution of carbon from one place to another, of one depth of soil to another. And this is sometimes a bit hard to grasp. So, for example, adding manure to a field is always going to be good for the health of the soil in that field. It'll increase organic matter content and so on. But it's not directly slowing climate change just by that, through that increase in carbon, because you have the manure anyway. If you'd not put it on that field, it would presumably go on to another field, so the carbon would have gone up there. So manure is obviously good, but it's not in itself mitigating climate change. And zero tillage is a little bit like that. Zero tillage, I think, does have a positive effect on climate change. Yeah, somebody put up questions. I guess I'm assuming we'll have questions at the end, so I'm certainly happy for questions. It's probably easiest to have them at the end. So zero tillage, the biggest thing that does is to concentrate organic matter near the soil surface. However, in the long run, I think zero tillage does tend to lead to slightly bigger stock in the soil. Measuring changes in organic carbon stock is not straightforward, because you have to measure bulk, the bulk density of the soil, not just the percent carbon in the soil. And there's a few points to remember at the bottom there. Soil carbon cannot increase indefinitely. It doesn't go up forever or down forever. If you're accumulating soil carbon, the highest rate of accumulation is in the early years, then it slows off. And it's reversible. You might be doing good things that increase soil carbon, but if you stop doing them, then you'll go back to where you were before that. Right, so that was just a few introductory points. Now, this is the structure of what I want to do. I'm going to have some miscellaneous points about soil carbon. That'll take quite a bit of time. And then I'm going to talk about how soil carbon changes pretty slowly in response to changes in management. Therefore, it's quite difficult to measure. Then have we got more sensitive ways of indicators of change, and then some concluding comments. So here's a picture of the global cartoon of the global carbon cycle, which is very nicely produced by a colleague at Exeter University. And you can see top right there, we're showing that there's this 750 gigatons of carbon in the CO2 in the world's atmosphere. And this is about half of what we've got in the organic matter in the soil, 1,500 gigatons, and you've got between 500 and 600 gigatons in all of the plants in the world. Now, sequestration, this word that we often talk about, means moving some of that carbon from atmospheric CO2 through into the soil. That will come through plants because it's photosynthesized, and then some of that plant carbon through roots or residues can get into the soil. Or alternatively, you can slow down, if you like, the breakdown of carbon, the flow from the soil to the atmosphere. That's what sequestration's about. Now, sometimes I give talks with this title, saying that sequestering carbon in cropland soil is not as easy as you think. Now, over a few decades, my thoughts on this have changed somewhat. 25, 30 years ago, I was an enthusiast, and I think many soil scientists were, because it was then that we realised how big this stock of carbon in the world's soil organic matter was. So it really mattered globally. And at that time, it was perceived by politicians, wrongly actually, it was perceived that we had overproduction of food, and therefore land could be removed from arable cropping. So we had set-aside schemes in the EU and a similar thing called Conservation Reserve Programme in the United States. So we could take land out of agriculture, and then that said, hey, we also, that gives us opportunities for doing things that are going to be good for locking up carbon. But now we're obviously in a different thing. So there's a thing, isn't there, that the past is a different country. Now we're concerned about global food security. How can we feed all the people who are in the world? United Nations Sustainable Development Goal number 2 is zero hunger, and we're certainly not there yet. So we've actually got very limited scope now, I would say, for removing land from agriculture. I know rewilding is a bit of a thing, but I think the areas involved cannot be huge. So we have to focus, if we want to try and lock up or sequester carbon in soil, we have to concentrate on land that continues in agriculture. It's not a matter of taking it out of agriculture, as perhaps we thought it was in the past. So I've put up an amber traffic light here about being cautious about how much carbon we can lock up in this way, and to be aware of exaggerated claims, which I think there are plenty. Now, back in 2015, when one of the big climate conference, COP21, was held in Paris, there was an initiative started there, which many of you may know about, called the 4 per mil or 4 per thousand initiative. And what the people who launched that said, that's what I've written up here, is if we increase by 4 parts per thousand, that's 0.4% each year, the quantity of carbon contained in soils, we can halt the annual increase in CO2 in the atmosphere. Now, this was a massive claim, which took many of us by surprise, and has been much criticised, actually. If we were really going to do that, if we really were going to halt the increase in CO2 in the atmosphere, we'd have to be locking up between 7 and 9 gigatons of carbon every year. Now that's really not on, and even the people who are still very much promoting this initiative, which has become very powerful and influential, have scaled back what they're saying can be done to between perhaps 1 and 2 gigatons of carbon per year. Although I think they've been a bit sneaky in the way that they have scaled it back. However, let's be fair, any increase in soil carbon is going to be good for soil health. And again, to be fair, this initiative, even though I'm very critical of it, has come to the attention of policymakers and brought a policy focus onto soils, which is good. It's good that politicians actually care about soils, maybe now, which most of my lifetime has not been the case. Now, again, there's been many, many big claims for the quantities of carbon that can be locked up in soils. And in the scientific literature, there's huge debates going on. I've given you the title of one paper at the top there, Managing Soil for Carbon Sequestration, Let's Get Realistic. I like that one. That's written by 2 very distinguished American soil scientists. And at the bottom, there's a paper which colleagues and I did based on our long-term experiments at Rothamsted. We said there were major limitations to achieving this 4 per thousand goal, if you like, for soil carbon. I'd say it's utterly impossible. We said there were major limitations. And in fact, what we found was, in our long-term experiments, the only way that you could reach that rate of increase was either by taking that out of agriculture, growing trees, or by adding huge amounts of manure. I'm going to give a couple of slides which look a bit complicated, but they just, I'll try and give you the message. It's 2 papers that I've been involved in that have been published just this year. One paper very much led by a very distinguished Canadian soil scientist, Henry Jansen. We tried to estimate how much photosynthesis is there in the world, how much of that is in cropland, and really that's the limit to how much carbon can be coming into our soils. And that calculation shows that we say that at present situation, the amount of carbon that we could conceivably lock up in our soils represent about 1.5% of current human derived emissions. So it's pretty small. Doesn't mean it's not trivial. It means, yeah, we need everything we can get in terms of slowing climate change, but it really isn't huge. And the other point, the point of that little picture on the right is that when organic matter comes into soil via plants, roots, residues, etc., much of it goes into what we call here ephemeral carbon. Carbon doesn't stay there very long. It's quickly broken down by microbes. Now, it's not wasted because the microbes are getting energy from it and doing all the good things that we want, but only quite a small fraction of that then gets converted into really stable material in soil. And then another little paper looked at the same sort of thing, and again made the point that much of the organic matter that was coming into our soils is broken down by microbes, good, giving them energy to do all the good stuff. But again, perhaps in the long run, only about 10% of what comes in gets locked in to stable organic matter. So this is saying if you put in 5 tons of carbon per hectare, this might lead to about 0.5 tons ending up in quite stable organic matter in the long run. Now, I think another issue with thinking about carbon sequestration is what I've called confused terminology. I'm focusing on the top left-hand box in green. How much carbon can we sequester in soils that continue in agriculture? Now, the top right-hand box is about removing land from agriculture. There are some opportunities for that, but I think not huge. The bottom right-hand box is avoiding carbon losses. Now, I think this is really, really important. Stopping deforestation, stopping the drainage of peatlands. A lot of this happening in South America, Southeast Asia, and Africa as well. I think these are really important. But and the big numbers there are big opportunities for avoiding additional losses. And globally, although I don't think in this country particularly, there are some opportunities for restoring degraded lands to some sort of semi-natural state. Now, if you add up all of those, you can get big numbers. But what happens, I think, is that people do that, get big numbers, but then sort of assume almost subliminally that those big numbers can all be achieved within agriculture. They're not. Sequestering extra carbon in an agricultural soil is not the same as avoiding a loss through not doing deforestation. So I think there can be confusion about big numbers here. A couple of points about paying for carbon. You will be at least as aware as I am. There's a lot of discussion about this. Should we be paying farmers, land managers for locking up carbon? Well, no doubt there'll be some views expressed on this later. A couple of points here is that, well, if you're on a sandy soil, you're never going to sequester as much carbon as someone on a soil that's high in clay or silt. So you could say there's an equity issue there, or you could say it's just luck of the draw where you happen to be doing your farming, I suppose. Then the other point that's often made is that if a farmer's been doing very good things over many years and has built up organic matter in soil to quite a high level, and soil is in very good condition, they can't do much more. So that in principle, that farmer can't be paid much because he or she can't sequester much extra carbon. Whereas if you start at a low level, then your potential for sequestering more carbon is much greater. So there's some real quite difficult issues there, I think, which again we may want to discuss later. So now, my points about it, soil organic matter changes slowly over periods of years and is actually quite difficult to measure. So here's some data on soil carbon from some of our long-term experiments at Rothamsted, as Alistair was saying. We've been going, I think, for 179 years or something like that now. Not me, I'm pretty old, but not that old. And so we've got plots which have had different treatments of no fertilizer, fertilizers, manure or whatever for many, many years. You can see a sort of an aerial picture of the oldest experiment called Broadbalk, where wheat is grown either continuously or in rotation there on the left. And we store samples of both crop and soils sampled over the years. You can see some of the very old bottles there on the left. Now, we can get big changes. So these, where you can see big increases over this 100 and something years, that's where huge amounts of manure have been applied. Not really practical, it's a experimental treatment. But actually, in real life, we'd be looking at the differences between these lines near the bottom, slightly more subtle changes. And here's another experiment, one that started in the 1940s. There were two starting points here, an old grassland soil and a soil that had been arable for a long time, right next door to each other, same soil type. The grassland soil that was ploughed and went into arable, not surprisingly, its organic matter content came down. Where it continued in grass, although with rather better management, it stayed high, went up a little bit. The one that started in arable but continued in arable, its organic matter content stayed pretty constant for a very long time. One version that was converted to grass went up. It's not caught up with the other one quite yet. This took about 50 years. So we often talk about the idea of an equilibrium level of organic matter in soils. They don't go up or down forever. So that's quite an important point. And as you get near to an equilibrium, the rate of change slows. Now, this is an illustration really of the difficulty of measuring real changes in soil carbon, if you like, in practical situations as opposed to long-term experiments. So we've got three sites, one at Rothamsted, silty clay loam soil, one at Woburn Farm, a sandy soil, Cottenham series, and an ADAS site, Morley. Many of you will know of this one. And in these sites, there were two treatments, either cereal straw removed or cereal straw incorporated. And they've been going on for either 20 or 10 to 20 years. And you can see the changes in soil carbon are quite small. Rothamsted gone from 1.8 to 1.9% carbon. Really quite a small change to measure, even after 22 years. Morley site gone from 0.9 to 1.1, a bit bigger. So we're looking at small increases, which are quite difficult to measure. So that's quite a challenge, especially in practical situations. Now, the man on the left in this picture here, Uncle David Jenkinson, who was a very good colleague of mine, and in fact my teacher and mentor when I was much younger. He died, as you see, about 10 years ago or more now. Here he had a sort of an illustration of this, of trying to measure these fairly small changes in soil carbon. Is like trying to weigh the captain of the ship. He always said that a very inefficient way of trying to weigh the captain would be to weigh the ship without the captain and to weigh the ship with the captain on it. The difference is obviously tiny. You can hardly see the captain here. I should have said he was a very splendid looking captain. He probably an admiral, I think. I found him on the internet. So trying to weigh the captain like that it will be a silly thing to do. And it's a bit like trying to measure a small change in soil carbon against a big background is like that. So, okay, if it's difficult to measure changes in total soil carbon against the big background, are there more sensitive things, cleverer things we can do to get some indication of change? I just noticed somebody's question popped up there that carbon's not the only thing, biodiversity is another. Absolutely right, of course. Are there more sensitive things we can do to sort of get an indication of whether organic matter content, carbon content is changing? And well, yes, there is. As it so happens, the work that I was involved in, gosh, 35 years ago, I'm showing my age, we measured what we call the microbial biomass in soil. This means the microbes in soil. We measured the amount of carbon held in the cells of living organisms. Well, it would be all types of organisms. And we did this in collaboration with a very good friend and colleague Phil Brooks, and another good friend and colleague in Denmark, Bent Christensen. And in Denmark at that time, they had 2 sites where straw had been either removed or incorporated over quite a long period. And we measured both the changes in total carbon with and without straw, but also the changes in what we call the microbial biomass. Now, what is microbial biomass? Well, as I said, it's the living organisms in soil, going from earthworms, if you like, but right through to fungi and bacteria and protozoa and so on. It's a small fraction, but a terribly important one. So the carbon in the living cells in soil is typically of the order of between 2 and 4 or 5% of total soil organic carbon. So it's a small fraction. It's obviously terribly important because of what it does, but it's a very active fraction. So these are some results that we got from these Danish experiments. Over here on the left, we've got the soil, the percent carbon, total carbon in the soil where straw was removed or straw was incorporated. Where it's incorporated, yes, it's a tiny bit higher, and the same with total nitrogen, but not statistically significantly different. The little tiny trend is there. Where we measured this microbial biomass, the carbon held in the cells of living organisms, we could easily measure that difference. It was about 40% more where straw had been incorporated. So we said, as we said in the title of our paper, those measurements of microbial biomass could give early indication, or I think we used the word early warning system for soil carbon changes. That's interesting. And here we did a sort of a model simulation of what happened if we put in straw. So here's total carbon in a soil that's in a stable situation, and here's total carbon gradually going up over a period of decades where straw is put in, but the microbial biomass goes up, reaches its sort of new equilibrium level much more quickly. So we said here that to get to 90% of the maximum value for total soil carbon took more than 80 years, whereas the same thing for microbial biomass, it got there in about 15 years. So we have got, if you like, early warning systems. And there are others. Microbial biomass is not that difficult to measure, but it's not the easiest thing to do, and it's a biological measurement. So if you sample the soil, you've got to keep it moist, take it back to the lab, make sure it doesn't dry out, and that sort of thing. If you're going to apply that on thousands of fields, it really would be quite challenging. You could do it, but it would be challenging. There are other measurements that can be done that have a similar, give us a similar result. Much more chemical measurements are actually easier to do. And there was a paper published about 3 years ago, nothing to do with me, where people looked at 3 other what we call labile fractions, fractions that turn over quite quickly, a bit like the carbon in living cells. So one was a fraction that's easily oxidized by a chemical, potassium permanganate, hot water extractable carbon, and particulate organic matter, so-called. So here the people looked at these 3 fractions here, and they compared how that changed with the change in total carbon, and they had 10, I think, quite long-term experimental sites across Europe. And they then compared 2 treatments. There were other treatments as well, but I've just extracted a couple here. So conventional tillage, but with low organic carbon input, and conventional tillage, but with high organic carbon input. As you can see, total carbon went up a little with the organic input, 16 point something up to 17, a 4.9% increase. But looking at the increases in these other fractions, we're looking at 17, 20, 17% increases. So these fractions all are changing more quickly than the total. So again, it makes it easier to see if a change is happening, just as with the microbial biomass. So that's good. We've got, you know, possibly some useful methods there for detecting changes in this slow moving total soil carbon. Another technique that's around, and some of you will be aware of this, is what people tend to call the CO2 burst. Now, some of the soil testing companies promote this as a soil health indicator. Now, frankly, I'm not actually convinced that it really is an indicator of soil health, but that's a debatable point. Excuse me. But it looks like it might be useful for giving early warning of soil organic carbon changes. So with this technique, you take a dried soil, so you haven't got to keep it moist, then you re-wet it in the lab and measure the amount of carbon dioxide coming off over a few days. Different techniques vary slightly. So it's quite simple, very easy, quite easy to do. Now, I didn't expect this to be very useful for all sorts of reasons, but there are some studies that seem to show that this measurement is quite well correlated, first of all, with microbial biomass, but also with some soil physical properties like aggregate stability. Now, I have to admit, I didn't expect that to be the case, but it looks like it might be useful. So we do have now these sort of early warning methods for soil carbon. So that's good, and I think quite useful. Now, they all are of a biological basis in some way. So the numbers that you will get will vary during the year according to whether it's the spring and you've not got much plant growth, or it's perhaps later in the year and there's been a lot of plant growth and roots going into the soil. But I think they're good for detecting whether or not there is a change happening, so change versus no change, and they can show whether soil carbon is going up or down, is it increasing or decreasing. So that's good. But what they do not do is show you how big that change is going to be in the long run. So if you're going to be paying for soil carbon, you know, so many pounds per tonne of carbon, they won't really give you the numbers that you want for that. They'll tell you, is it changing or not? Is it going up or going down? And roughly what sort of rate it's changing, you know, either fast or slow, but it won't tell you. It will not tell you that in 10 years' time you will have sequestered 5 tonnes of carbon. That's not what they'll tell you. So, so they're good, but they've got limitations, these measurements. There are new measurement approaches, sort of much more high-tech looking ones. For example, you can shine infrared light on soil samples. This is being done on the pictures on the left here. And it's sort of an indirect way of measuring the amount of carbon and other things actually in a soil. So it's a quicker and easier method of analysis. And the graph on the right here shows a comparison of soil carbon measured by traditional methods and by these new infrared methods. And the scatter, but they're not terrible by any means. You can also put those sort of sensors in a drone and look down on the land and estimate your soil carbon and other things. And you can do things on crops more commonly like this way, like this. And we've tested it on some of our long-term experiments. And here again is, if you like, measured by ordinary methods and estimated with the sensor on the drone. There's well, you can see again, by no means perfect, but it's getting there. So I think there's there is interesting prospects here. So the benefits of these infrared methods are rapid analysis. If you're doing the lab, you can analyze many more samples, and reasonable agreement with chemical analysis, and it's getting better all the time. Limitations: you've got to calibrate properly against known soils that have been analysed by, if you like, regular traditional methods. If you're going to do it with a drone, you're only seeing the surface. You're going to have bare soil. If the crop's growing a lot, you won't see much soil. If there's no bare soil, you won't get a measurement. But by looking only at the surface, you're only seeing changes in that surface layer, the very surface layer. For sequestration, you've got to think about the stock in some depth of soil. So you can't do that. And this question of calibration is very important. I gather, only anecdotally, there are some companies in Australia offering this service, but they're calibrating their measurements on soils in one place, but then applying them to different soil types hundreds of miles away. Now, this really is not on. So again, there's good prospects here, I think, some prospects, but we're not really there yet. And you know, again, it's a question of sometimes people claiming too much for a new method, so getting overexcited by it really too early. Right, some sort of closing points now. There's a paper, you'll have heard this phrase, natural climate solutions, probably. And there's a paper, very comprehensive paper by some very distinguished soil scientists. I've got some criticism of this paper, but they've got a very good point in the end of it. They say soil organic carbon sequestration is not an alternative to emissions reductions, but an additional opportunity. Should be neither dismissed nor exaggerated. So don't say there's nothing in it at all, but don't claim too much. We're not going to save the planet from climate change by locking up carbon in soil. We just can't do enough of it. That can help a little bit, goes in the right direction. So we shouldn't either dismiss it or exaggerate it. So my final 2 slides, I think now, are here's my suggested priorities for climate change mitigation. Specifically talking about that now. 1, we should be cutting emissions. This means, you know, phasing out fossil fuels as much as we can, and don't let politicians and industry off the hook by claiming too much for carbon sequestration. We can do a bit, but alone it's not going to save the planet in that sense. So don't dismiss it, but sure, don't exaggerate it. So that's the first thing. Now, we should certainly, my next priority is cut the carbon losses from the natural carbon stocks. So that means I really want to see an absolute minimization or stopping of deforestation globally, and particularly of draining peatlands globally, expanding agricultural areas. These are really big numbers that can be saved here. Now that implies, of course, that we've got to grow more crops on the areas that we currently have. So lots of challenges there. Number 3, yes, within agriculture, let's increase the greenhouse gas friendly practices. So yeah, for carbon, let's have cover crops where we can. Let's retain crop residues. Let's reduce tillage. It has some benefit. Let's have rotations. Let's have agroforestry. All of those things. Particularly, I would say, let's manage nitrogen very well, because there are very big greenhouse gas emissions associated with nitrogen fertilizer. It's difficult to escape from them. First of all, in manufacturing the fertilizer, but when you use it, a little bit of it comes off as nitrous oxide, which is a greenhouse gas almost 300 times more powerful than CO2. So anything we can do to manage our nitrogen more closely and more efficiently helps for climate change. Don't forget, it's all got to be done in the context of actually people like you making a profit and producing food for everybody else. Globally, I think there is some issues to do with doing something to abandoned or degraded land. I don't think that's such an issue in this country. Okay, so my final points really in the context of thinking about sort of payments for soil carbon. In terms of soil carbon, I think now climate change is enormously important. No question about that. But within agriculture, I think the focus needs to be primarily on sustainable food security and soil health. I know the word sustainable is overused, a bit hackneyed, but you know, I want my grandchildren and the grandchildren of my friends in Kenya and India and everywhere else to have food available for them. They don't at the moment in many cases. So it's the ability to keep using our soils to grow food, it seems to me, is an enormous priority. So all the things that we can do to increase organic matter and carbon in soil will help that. It will make the soils more resilient. So that's great. And that should be our, I think, I suggest, is our primary focus. There will be some climate change mitigation there, and that's a really welcome co-benefit. But I think we shouldn't see it as the primary goal of looking at soil carbon. Number two, should we be paying for the quantity of carbon sequestered? Well, I already said there are difficulties in measuring it or estimating it because it's small changes, it happens slowly, there's spatial variability. We can do measurements, and certainly we can use computer models of soil carbon to help us there. So I think there are prospects there, but it's difficult. And again, there's this equity thing. If you've got certain soil types or done certain previous practices, you'll be starting in a different situation. So some people will have an easier run at it than others. Personally, I would prefer to see payments or policies to, if you like, to encourage what we might call carbon-friendly practices, but with the goal of sustainability. Now, often that will actually go hand in hand with slowing climate change. So paying for carbon, if paying for carbon is the only show in town, as some of the companies that I've talked to say, well, okay, maybe that's useful to pay in that way because it's encouraging practices that are good for sustainability. You could debate that one round and round. Certainly, I think the use of models rather than basing everything on measurements that are difficult is sensible. But if we're using models, I would like to see these ground truthed more at the benchmark sites. Up to now, we've developed and tested these models at experimental sites. But I think if we had some benchmark sites across the country where we looked at different management practices, we could check our models out against them. We could investigate new predictors of change, these new early warning systems, perhaps soil health indicators, and they could also be a focus for farmers and researchers interacting with each other, because I think that's where we can often get a lot of benefit. And at the same time, my sixth point is we really want to be continually improving nitrogen management because of this nitrous oxide business. Even small improvements in nitrogen use efficiency can cut nitrous oxide quite a bit, and I often have said for carbon, think nitrogen. So at that point I'm finishing, I think. Yep, so thank you for your attention, and I'm sure there's lots of questions. I saw them popping up on my screen, so let's go for them.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you very much, David. That's fantastic. And you're quite right. The questions have been coming in thick and fast. I'm going to go from the top down, but before I do, I'm actually going to cover two together. The last one that came in from Tina and one that I put in earlier. You alluded to peat soils being a great source of emissions, particularly once they've been drained. And we're both interested in, and of course, these are the soils which produce a great deal of our food, particularly fresh fruit and vegetables. So what are your views on re-wetting and the implications of re-wetting drained peat soils on nitrous oxide and methane emissions?
Right. Well, I'm not an expert on peat, I have to say that. However, yes, if you do re-wet peat or any soil, you will certainly for some while be getting increased methane emissions. And I think also if the soil has got quite a lot of nitrogen in it, you will again, perhaps for a limited period, but certainly to start with, you will get increased nitrous oxide emissions. I mean, I know a lot of people, some people say, yes, we should be re-wetting all of our drained peats. Now, that to my mind, that really means sort of flooding the whole of the fens. Now, I've a feeling that may not really be practical, to be honest. You know, maybe theoretically in an ideal world, perhaps you would do that, but that really doesn't seem to me to be on. I mean, I think we should certainly be preserving, doing things to restore and preserve the peats, the upland peat soils, where they're either getting damaged or there might be a risk of them being drained for other purposes. So let's keep the big stocks that we've got, but as a sort of a national program for sequestering carbon, re-wetting the peats that are already in use for very, for really commercial and profitable high value crop agriculture. That doesn't seem to me really a practical prospect. And certainly, at least in the short term and maybe longer term, you would get increased emissions of these other greenhouse gases.
I think that fits in very well with your point about sustainable food security also been a very important part of this whole discussion that we have. Yes. John Hawkins is asking, should we treat our soils like a rechargeable battery when it comes to carbon storage potential? That's an interesting question.
Yes, I saw that come up, and I almost got diverted in my thinking there, because I thought that's an interesting idea. So yes, in a way they are, you could think of it like that, because you put carbon into soils through plant roots, crop residues, or whatever, and most of it gets used up because the microbes break it down. They use it to get energy, and the microbes do the good things that we want them to do, but then they need some more. So yes, in many ways that's actually, I think, a nice illustration. I like that very much. Because it's really, as I said, it's the flow of energy through the soils that's so important for many of the functions that we're looking for. You know, the functions of releasing organic matter, releasing nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur from organic matter, and also of producing good physical structure and underpinning the biodiversity in the soil as well. So it's that flow through. It's not just a matter of locking it up.
So Robert Nightingale's also asking a very good question. On the point around good levels of carbon in the soil, should there be rewards for keeping that stock of carbon there? And that's quite interesting when we think about permanent pasture situations, which also lock up soil, but rely on income from livestock grazing, which emit methane. And there's another question further down which kind of relates to this same subject of, you know, what is the trade-off there?
Well, yes, I mean, in a way, if we're going to be paying for anything, I favour the idea, if you like, of paying for practices that maintain a good level of organic matter in soils. And it's hard to say what that level is, because the practical level will be different for a sandy soil and a clay soil, for example. If you're, as I sort of alluded to earlier, if you've been doing good management over a good many years, you're probably at a reasonable level for your soil type already. So it's not then a matter of paying you to increase it further, because that's probably not practical. But if you like, paying for good practices that maintain it where it is seems to me a logical thing to do. Because again, it's doing what's good for the long term, and this sort of trade-off between the long-term sustainability, if you like, of the soil and the short-term profit is always a very difficult thing.
Yeah. The next question, I think you've probably answered pretty well, actually, but you might wish to just re-emphasize. Is carbon the only measure of success? What about biodiversity of the soil?
I couldn't agree more. They sort of go together hand in hand, really. We need all these organisms in the soil to do their stuff. Of course we do. In general, if you are delivering organic matter into your soil through roots or residues or manures or other organic, in quotes, wastes, you will be doing things that are good for carbon, but the organisms will tend to follow that, I think. I mean, I think, you know, sometimes there are companies that will try to sell you some magic organism. I generally don't, with a very few exceptions, I don't generally believe in these, because if you add some organisms to soil, they usually just die, because the organisms that are there are really good at eating things. So I think, if you like, the biodiversity, generally speaking, I think, will follow the carbon. It's not entirely true. Some work by one of my former colleagues, some of you know, looking at earthworms, found that actually tillage had a bigger effect on earthworm numbers than manure applications. So you've got higher numbers where you've got min-till, and that, if you like, the min-till versus conventional ploughing difference was much bigger in earthworm numbers than the with or without manure difference. So, you know, the other factors come into play for sure, but in general, I think your organisms will follow the carbon.
And Gareth, Clay's asking an interesting question too. Is the estimate of carbon that can be absorbed in arable soils using a conventional or a regenerative farming model? And I'm quite interested in this too, because the regenerative farming approach really is taking us way back to the Norfolk four-course rotation, which basically consisted of 2 years of exploitation and 2 years of restoration to fuel that. And we seem to have rebadged that in a different way a few hundred years later. Do you have any comments to make on that?
Well, I think you've summarised it really rather well. I mean, yes, I mean, we know from some of the experiments at Rothamsted of Woburn Farms, experiments not done by me but by some of my colleagues, that if we have a if you like, a lay arable system, is the terminology that I'm used to, you know, of a certain number of years of a grass or grass clover lay, followed, then ploughed up, and then followed by some arable cropping for a number of years, the average organic matter content will be higher in the lay arable system than in a pure every year arable system, for sure. If the difference is not necessarily huge, but in terms of the quality and the functioning of the soil, that small difference can be quite important in terms of soil structure and physical structure. So I actually think that those sort of systems, you can call them regenerative if you like, are really useful, really valuable. I'd like to see them encouraged. I suppose the question is, can you make a profit from it? You've got to do something with the if you're going to have a lay period, you're presumably going to be growing animals on it. Now, if you're an arable farmer, perhaps you don't want the bother of animals, but maybe there's more scope for animal and arable people to work together. That's I know that happens to some extent. So ways of getting those sort of rotations with some herbal lays, I guess is the phrase, into them, I think is highly beneficial.
Which moves us beautifully on to the next question from Dave Arnott, who's heard that one way to lock up more carbon into the soil is to bury it deeper, and you do that perhaps by deeper ploughing, for instance. Although some work we've done here has demonstrated that deep rooting species within your rotational mixes, and you've just mentioned multi-species lays, which do offer the opportunity to do that, and are a good way to put carbon down in the soil. But what's your views on ploughing carbon down to preserve it?
I'm not keen on that. I think that it sounds a very dodgy thing to my mind. There is some respectable work in Australia, which suggests that supporting this idea of burying carbon by deep ploughing. But it seems to me what we know that big physical disturbance tends to increase organic matter decomposition by breaking up aggregates and the like. So I'm really very suspicious of that approach. It seems to me that yes, some of the carbon, when it does get deep down, might become stabilized, but I fear that in most situations that benefit is going to be outweighed by the extra decomposition it takes to get it there. So I'm pretty dubious about that, to be honest. I mean, I could be wrong, but I'm not convinced. I think the idea of having lays with multi-species with different depths of roots for all sorts of good reasons will be, in my view, a more practical and more sensible way to go.
Yes, I think I would agree with that, and that's without us looking at the impact on the soil biology of that intensive work, which we've already said is important. Jenny Coombs is just asking for your opinion on what you think about the carbon offsetting companies that want to pay farmers to do this so that they can carry on as business as usual.
This is a tricky one. I've talked with some of these companies, and I've got mixed feelings, to be honest. On the one hand, paying for, so you get money for offsets for other, companies. Apparently big multinationals are wanting to pay for carbon offsets to offset their emissions that they really can't cut any other, I think, to be fair, I think I'm told that many big companies are doing what they can to cut their emissions, but there are some that they just can't get any lower, so they're keen to pay for offsets. Now, there's two different things here that go in opposite directions, I think. First of all, within a farm, you're going to have your own emissions anyway. If you're using nitrogen fertilizer, there'll be emissions associated with that. There's emissions associated with the diesel from your tractors and all the, the heating of your buildings, etc., etc. So you've got your own emissions. So you might feel it's better any carbon that you can sequester in your soils, you might think it's better to use that to offset your own emissions rather than somebody else's. So that's one point. However, in a slightly funny way, I'm not quite as against the idea as I perhaps used to be, on the grounds that, well, if carbon is the only show in town for getting more money into farming, and there are people willing to do it, and because carbon tends to go hand in hand with good practices that are going to be good for the sustainability and long-term functioning of the soil, maybe pragmatically, well, let's do it. Let's use that as a way of getting money in to help farmers to do practices that perhaps they may not do otherwise, because there's not going to be a short-term gain from doing it. So I've got mixed feelings, as you can see.
But perhaps it does make a good case for your assertion that we should have benchmark sites that we have around the country, where we can monitor this long term, which rather fits with a comment from Felicity Ruth, who has pointed out that soils in Australia are, of course, very different from those of the UK. And I know when I started to look at greenhouse gas emissions from soils here in the United Kingdom, I found they were very different to much of the published evidence which came from the United States, because of climate and moisture and so on being very different.
Yeah, well, that's true. In the US, for example, I mean, in many parts, in the Midwest, in places like Idaho, you've basically got a continental climate, where things freeze up pretty much in the winter, which is not the case. And in Central Europe, parts of sort of towards the east in Germany, Poland, Czech Republic. So you've got. Although in some ways you can almost say superficially agriculture doesn't look so different, where you've got situations where the soil freezes up completely in winter, it's a different situation to our sort of maritime temperate climate. I mean, long ago I worked on things with nitrate leaching, and again that's different. So we get leaching right through the winter period. It's really important. Whereas in places with a continental climate where it freezes up, you don't get that. You might get a burst in the spring when it thaws. So there are a lot of things that are rather different. In other parts of the US, you've got some, sort of subtropical or much warmer situations.
Well, we're running out of time now, so I'll just finish off with the last question, and I apologise to anybody whose question I haven't quite got to. I have skipped around a little bit because some of the questions were asked and then David answered them in his presentation later on in it. Digby Sowerby's asking whether the concept of carbon sequestration, if we can't do it in agriculture, where else are we supposed to do it? And that's a very good point, really. I wonder what your views on that are.
Well, I think my view there is where I go back to this thing about the what I said was the sort of confused terminology. I think we need to do much more globally on avoiding the emissions from land use change. So it's not sequestering it, but it's holding on to the stocks that we've got. So the deforestation in the Amazon area, particularly in Brazil, under the government that's sort of encouraging it. It may be good for people expanding farms. Maybe we need some of that to feed the world, but we're really, we're releasing I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but we're releasing a lot of carbon by doing that sort of thing. And similarly, by draining peatlands, particularly to grow more oil palm, in both Southeast Asia, but increasingly I gather in parts of Africa as well now. These are releasing lots of carbon. So in a sense, my focus will be much, from a carbon point of view, will be much more on finding ways of stopping or at least minimizing those emissions, cutting those emissions. And then in terms of our places where we're doing agriculture already, let's do the things that we can do. If we can sequester a bit of carbon, yeah, that's great. Let's have it. But as I say, my focus really, I feel in these situations, is making sure that we're not losing carbon, that we're doing the best we can to increase where we can, but being sensible about the amounts we're claiming, but particularly focusing on making sure that we've got soils in good condition, stable conditions for growing food and so on in the future.
And that's a very good place to end this discussion, really, isn't it? Because as you've already said, this is not just all about carbon, and it's not just about soil biodiversity, but it's about the productivity of soils and our ability to resiliently feed ourselves against a background of climate change. So David, I want to thank you most sincerely for coming and sharing the wealth of knowledge that's come through your career, but also particularly to commend you on your ability to make that clear to those of us who are perhaps not so scientifically qualified. It is a skill. Not everybody has it, but I think you really made your message very clear this afternoon. And may I thank also all the people who asked questions. Apologies to those who I didn't get to. Thank you to everybody else for joining us. And do look forward to more of these webinars on different subjects coming from GWCT going forward. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks again, David.
Thank you. Pleasure to meet you all. Bye.